Welcome. This is Martin Garkson, Communication Studies Professor at Colorado State University and the founder and director of the CSU Center for Public Deliberation. I'm putting together this kind of a little short series of videos to explain kind of the work behind the CBD and kind of a growing national movement on deliberative engagement, particularly for a program with the Kettering Foundation called the Centers for Public Life program, which is working to kind of launch a center similar to CBD kind of across the country to be resources for their local community. But the content should be kind of valuable kind of broadly in a sense. I'm going to start off kind of quickly just giving my an introduction, and then I'm going to go through kind of a PowerPoint presentation that I've given quite often kind of across the country talking about this work. To introduce myself, I'm actually trained more as an argumentation scholar. My work is always focused on how do we talk about tough issues in our community. My early work and PhD focused more on the national level and basically resulted in a lot of academic papers that focused on how badly we talked about tough issues and how we talked past each other and how we kind of ignored information. From an argumentation background, I've always been focused on what kind of arguments people make, what kind of sources do they cite, what kind of logic or lack thereof are they relying on, the role of emotion, the role of storytelling, and those type of things. And I grew frustrated with my work analyzing national politics because all it seemed to be is really kind of focusing what's wrong. So when I got my job at Colorado State University about 14 years ago, I shifted my focus from a national to a local perspective, and also switched from being more of a kind of an academic or a critic to being much more of a practitioner. So the CBD is kind of this applied arm to the work that I do. We train undergraduate students as facilitators, and then we design, run, and report on innovative kind of events, helping our community, the Northern Colorado community, kind of focus on and have better conversations about tough issues. The CBD, in a way, is kind of this ongoing experiment of what happens when you have an institution that puts all its time, all its energy, all its resources, all its expertise into really elevating the conversation versus focused on winning the argument. And it's been a successful experiment so far, and we're working with the Kettering Foundation to kind of expand the work of these local kind of hubs of democracy that are really focused on helping people elevate the conversation. So with these series, I'm going to do kind of a series of 3 videos tied to a presentation I gave. So I'm going to share my screen here really quick. As an overall introduction to kind of deliberative engagement as we go, you've got my contact information on there, so feel free to email me any questions you have about the different slides. There's a lot of academic work behind all this, but this presentation is primarily geared more to kind of practitioners to start thinking about how do you change the conversation in your local community. These are just some of the projects that the CBD has worked on the last 10 years. All these projects have generally come to us from the community. Whether we're working with the city or the county or different nonprofit organizations, different groups that care about different issues. So we are kind of process expertise, and then we apply our processes to lots of different issues, again, focused on elevating the conversation and helping us have the conversations that we feel democracy really requires. Here's one picture of one of our events. The young lady in blue on the left side is one of my students. The student next to her is also a note taker. But what we're able to do with our processes is 100 people show up at a meeting. Instead of sitting and watching a panel of experts or perhaps one walking up to a microphone one at a time, we can put those 100 people into separate tables and having not only a trained facilitator generally, but also a facilitator kind of trained for that specific event that we designed to have the kind of conversation that we need to have as we kind of go through. As I start my presentations, I often kind of ask this question using the little kind of wires clicker technology just to kind of set the stage. That if you think about the kind of conversations you're having in the community, the current quality of public discourse or political communication. I can't do this through a video, obviously, so this is just some answers when I work with the Colorado Leadership Foundation in the room. But when we ask people to pick 3 of these terms, here's pretty typical results. I've been doing this the last couple of years. Obviously, as you look through those answers, there's a few negative terms, there's a few positive terms. Some that are somewhat neutral, dominated by experts, might depend on kind of your perspective on experts. But these are pretty typical in the sense that the top 5 answers picked all the negative ones. Right? Polarized is often the number 1, simplistic's number 2, dominated by a few loud voices, mean-spirited, weak and apathetic. A few positive ones kind of sprinkled in there. But clearly, the problem is clear that we need to kind of change this. And a lot of the work of the Center for Public Deliberation, a lot of work for the Kettering Centers for Public Life program and organizations like the National Coalition for Dialogue and Deliberation is to change this, which is kind of both how do we de-emphasize some of those negative terms and make it a little less likely, and also how do we change it so some of those positive terms are much more likely to be picked. Over these 3 videos that I'm doing, I'm going to make kind of 3 broad arguments. The first is this basic reality of introducing or kind of really exploring the concept of wicked problems. And when we start looking at the tough problems that we're dealing with in our community as wicked problems, it starts the process of really kind of changing the conversation and helping us think through what kind of talk do we need to be able to address those problems more productively. Then the second video is really going to kind of get into the bad news. Some research I've been doing the last couple years in particular with brain science and social psychology, but also really drawing on my 10 years of practitioner experience and also with the literature that really kind of point to why are our conversations so bad? Why is it so difficult to take on the kind of issues that we need to take on? At the end of the second video, things are going to be pretty dark and depressing. So you're really going to want to watch the third video, which is making the argument that once we recognize number 1 and number 2, once we recognize most of the problems we're dealing with are wicked problems, and then we understand both how our brains work and how, unfortunately, many of our institutions and our processes don't work, then we can start kind of building up capacity to change that, particularly at the local community, to spark the kind of conversations that we need for democracy to work much better. Right? So with that, I'm going to go ahead and jump in to that first argument and talk about wicked problems here as we're going through. Right? So wicked problems is a concept kind of really going all the way back to the 1970s. The people originally kind of came up with were actually city engineers who were trained in school as engineers to look at things through kind of technical lens. But once they started working in communities, they found out that the kind of problems that they were taught to solve in the classroom were very different than the kind of problems they were facing in their local communities. So they came up with the concept of wicked problems to capture that. The key aspect of wicked problems is that they inherently involve competing underlying values and paradoxes and trade-offs that can't be resolved by science. So I'm going to provide several different examples on here. But wicked problems clearly kind of require a different way of talking and engaging and kind of researching the issue. So this is one issue that we work with a lot here in northern Colorado, that water is clearly kind of a wicked problem. We don't get enough rain. We get a lot of water in May and June when all the snow melts and kind of goes on by, and over 100 years of building reservoirs and ditches and things like that, we've actually built up a pretty strong agricultural community in northern Colorado based on a strong kind of working river. But we've also realized more and more over the years as we learn more about water and the health of rivers and hydrology that we're perhaps overworking the river. Northern Colorado is a wonderful place to live, so more and more people are kind of moving here. So that's kind of putting even more kind of pressure in it, and it's becoming more and more of an issue. And we were asked, going back 7 years ago, by the CSU Water Institute and the Community Foundation of Northern Colorado to help us have a conversation about water in Northern Colorado, because it was getting more and more adversarial, more and more kind of mean-spirited in a lot of different ways. So these are one of the kind of first steps we often do in our projects is to create what I'm calling a wicked problem slide, which is, through analyzing public discourse, through talking to people, and looking at different websites, at different activist groups, and engaging the kind of literature to really identify kind of what are the underlying values, what are the things people care about when they talk about the river, when they talk about kind of water. So these are 9 that came out. A lot of this came from an initial meeting where we had 300 people, asked them to kind of fill out an open-ended kind of questionnaire, asking them some questions about the river. And the reason this shows kind of a really clear example of wicked problem is if you look at these 9 things one at a time, these are all good things, right? The problem isn't wicked people with bad values. The wickedness is in the problem. And that shift is a big part of what we'll be talking about, is how do we shift from the easy assumption of wicked people to the much more complex but productive question of how do we manage wicked problems. If you look at these, taken one at a time, we all agree these are good things. The heart of the wicked problem, however, is the tension between these things. The inherent reality that the more we focus on some of these, inherently the less we'll be able to focus on others, or they'll be even pushed back. Not necessarily zero sum, that these are kind of, you have to have one or the other, but that these things don't fit together very well. And they require kind of communication and collaboration and innovation to find the best ways to get them to work together, And often they also require a prioritization, a weighing of these choices, of recognizing which these are. The problem is most public discourse doesn't do that. Most public discourse is focused within one box. People like to frame things as if I have a positive value and those that disagree with me reject that value. It gives our brain kind of what we want, and it's a very compelling narrative. So a lot of the work of deliberative engagement is identifying these underlying values, putting them on the table, helping people see the inherent tensions between them, and helping them work through them productively. And that's a very different kind of conversation. Similarly, experts tend to kind of exist within the box. Experts, by definition, know a whole bunch about a little bit, right? Versus kind of understanding kind of the broad kind of connections across those. So a lot of our work is to get away from the myopic kind of focus on individual boxes and really get people to think about the connections and the consequences and the interactions between all these different values. So we do lots of different examples that we played with over the years. This is from a process we did in Steamboat a few years ago. We want our food system to do lots of things for lots of people, but those don't fit together very well necessarily. Healthcare is a very complex problem that can be kind of summarized in these three things that we really want, but they don't work together very often. And again, you'll notice how public discourse tends to focus on one or two of these, framing them, how can anyone be against accessibility? But the question is, we want all three of those to work together. I was asked to help with parking. Like most universities, we have a parking issue at CSU. I originally assumed it was kind of a technical problem, but then again, we did some surveys and had people kind of respond, and you see all these values kind of come to the forefront in a way. And how you design a parking system on a campus has a lot of value-laden inherent kind of tensions to work through. Capitalism or sustainability can easily be defined as a wicked problem. The notion of a triple bottom line, getting away from the single bottom line of just profit in the business world. Communities must kind of think about a triple bottom line that, yes, profit in economics is important, but we also care about people. We also care about the planet. Those three, unfortunately, don't always work well together. Right? I do like showing this one in particular because part of the issue is not always kind of making tough choices between the values. It can often be a better conversation can help us kind of transcend the tensions in some senses. So certainly green jobs is a nice job of taking a environmental versus economic tension that's kind of been historical and transcending that, and that we're creating wealth and creating jobs by kind of focusing on green energy while at the same time having a positive for the planet. Finally, I'll make the argument that democracy itself is essentially a wicked problem. If we go back to the preamble of the Constitution, the founders framed things in this way. They highlighted kind of 5 big values in there as the purpose of working to establish a more perfect union, which I think is wonderful phrasing. Because part of what we'll get in with wicked problems is you don't solve them. You don't kind of find for all time the perfect mix of values. So America was set up essentially as an ongoing conversation, as an ongoing kind of negotiation between these important values. But if we take these 5 values from the preamble and translate them into a little bit more kind of common terms, you can kind of get these 5 big American values, maybe not the top 5, but pretty important. Once again, if you take these one at a time, these are all good things. I think everyone prefers justice to injustice and prefers security versus kind of being scared for their life. The issue in democracy is not which one of these do you talk about or which one of these do you use to frame your arguments. It's how do we deal with the tensions between these, right? And which are most important. And when these are in competition with each other, how much do they win? Unfortunately, we don't have that conversation naturally, right? So again, part of the job of these deliberative organizations is to identify those underlying values, put them on the table, and help people work through them more productively. And there's certainly another kind of aspect, another thing I do with the clicker sometimes, I've been doing this for the last 10 years, is asking people, okay, if we take these one at a time, we all agree they're good, but if you had to pick your most important, and been doing this for the last 10 years, I always get answers like this, and every single one of them gets picked. Right? And which one's first is always kind of different in some ways. But if I have more than 10, 15 people in the room, it's very rare that I don't have every single one of them picked as the most important. Then when I ask the more difficult question, which one's least important, this takes always a little bit longer as people kind of struggle to kind of pick this. But once again, I typically get every single value represented in some way with that. So we all, one of the philosophical arguments about wicked problems or even about democracy is, in a lot of ways, we actually all have the same values. What makes us different is how we rank those values. in individual situations where we're making choices, where we have to make a choice between these values. So in that room, people rank these values in very different ways, and those rankings have consequences. Here are just some of the kind of inherent tensions that are clear in democracy. Freedom and equality are often kind of the two kind of dominant kind of terms, values to support in a democracy, but freedom and equality don't go very well together. We certainly know in economic terms, the more economic freedom we have, the more inequality that we have. So that's a tension that's the heart of democracy that we tend not to talk about. We talk about freedom, we talk about equality, but how often do we talk about the tension between them? The tension between our freedom and freedom of future generations is a key tensions with the environmental movement. Freedom and security is a key tension that comes out every time we go to the airport or we talk about civil liberties and national security. And then justice in itself, kind of going back to Aristotle, I think he was right of kind of framing justice as a tension within itself. Justice is getting exactly what you deserve, no more, no less, whether that's punishment or reward or merit. So you don't maximize justice. Justice is something you're trying to find a balance. And Jonathan Haidt's work's done a really nice job of looking at how both progressives and conservatives kind of utilize justice, but apply it in a very different way, right? Whereas progressives kind of tie justice to equality and equity, and progressives kind of tie justice more to kind of merit, right, and inequality in some ways. So we use those words and they're powerful words, but how often do we really kind of talk through the implications of those words? And that's just some of the tensions. A lot of taking a wicked problems perspective and thinking about deliberation is really focusing on those underlying tensions that are often not discussed and kind of, again, bringing them to the forefront and helping them work through them. So every issue that we've done in the last 10 years, we inherently work to kind of pull these out and help people work on them. Right? So that's the kind of the key aspect of wicked problems. Is that when you look at a problem, instead of looking directly for the solution, instead of looking for a magic bullet, instead of looking for a devil figure causing it behind the scenes, the first thing you try to look for is, okay, what are the underlying values? What are the different things people care about? And what are the tensions between those? And that starts inherently kind of changing the conversation and the perspective. I'm going to talk quickly about a few other kind of key aspects. I already briefly mentioned that wicked problems are not solvable. Any solution, if you narrow it and you might be able to move the needle on one value, but you're going to have consequences to other ones. So the best job is to kind of sit back and try to map the entire system, and really, instead of looking for solutions to kind of end the problem, you're looking at better ways of managing the problem, better ways of negotiating kind of between those different values. And that systemic view is really kind of catching on now. From that perspective, the optimal solutions to wicked problems require adaptive changes. And what that means is it's not just coming up with a policy kind of top down. It's not just experts in the back room kind of coming up with the right way to do things. It's going to require kind of a broad range of actors to think about how we best kind of manage these different values. So looking at, say, K-12 issues, we need everyone at the table in some ways. And adaptive changes means people are going to have to change their behavior. And we know from psychology, particularly in the United States, that people don't change their behavior because they're told to by experts or people in authority. They change their behavior if they have some ownership of it, if they see the value of it. So those are the kind of conversations and projects that we're trying to spark. So we really like to look, kind of pulling on the notion of democratic governance. The best way local communities can kind of address wicked problems is across sectors. So yes, there's individual behavior. Yes, there's public policy, but also in between, there's a role of public and private and nonprofits and new coalitions and connections and interpersonal, and how do we spark those kind of conversations? Collaboration is such a powerful term now, and everyone loves collaboration. Collaboration is difficult, right? So a lot of times these organizations, we're collaborative, ongoing collaborative support to help people kind of keep this conversation going and keep that the quality of the conversation elevated. Fourth, addressing wicked problems requires effective collaboration and communication across multiple perspectives. We have to be able to talk to each other. From the initial slide, that's not what we're getting right now, right? We're hyper-partisan, we're polarized, we make horrible assumptions about the motives of the other side, and that just undermines all the conversations we need to have. So how, at least in our local communities, do we start taking more responsibility for the quality of our conversations, recognizing that the quality of our conversation is going to have a huge impact on the quality of our community. And then lastly, and we'll get back into this a little bit later in the third video, the best kind of treatment for wicked problems is creativity, innovation, and imagination. And the good news is that's kind of what humans can be best at when we design things to tap into that, right? So it's not just accumulated knowledge, it's not just about expertise, but it's about wisdom and it's about judgment. So how do we create the opportunities for people to actually kind of build those muscles and utilize those skill sets rather than just such a focus on knowledge or such a focus on expertise. So with that, that's the end of this first video, which is kind of going through just the basic reality of wicked problems and starting seeing the world through this wicked problems lens and how that starts changing the conversation. So we'll be back pretty soon with the next video, which is kind of the bad news of why our human nature, our processes, and our institutions are all just, unfortunately, really poorly suited for wicked problem. So with that, I'll stop the share here.